have to make adjustments. The world is not what you expected it to be. But you have to have the wherewithal to reach out and grab hold and turn the world until it fits what you have to say and why you're here to say it. I'm here because of the dead. I'm here because of soldiers who served in Yosemite and Sequoia National Park over 100 years ago. Soldiers who were forgotten. Soldiers who fought for Yosemite, who fell in love with Yosemite, who dreamed of Yosemite when they slept at night, bivouacked in their wool blankets at the height of the world. I tell their story because they can't speak for themselves, because they've passed on. And all honor that is given to me, I give unto them, because they're the ones that did the work. They're the ones that rode the trails. They're the ones that protected the second and third oldest national parks in the United States, Sequoia National Park and Yosemite. So for me, even though this is a great honor for the Committee for Green Foothills to recognize my work, the honor and all honor goes unto Yosemite and to Sequoia and to the range of light and to the earth itself. But given that I am here, it's time to thank Ron and Megan and Justyne, who for me have become the face of the Committee for Green Foothills. And for me, it is a recognition that even though we have these celebrated landscapes like Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Canyonlands, Arches, Zion, Wrangell St. Elias, Bryce Canyon, we have these places, but nature begins right outside our own door. And sometimes in some faraway part of the world, we just don't have the financial wherewithal or the time to get over there and make those changes, but we do have control over what is outside our own front door. And with that, let's give a round of applause for the Committee for Green Foothills for daring to make changes right outside their own front door. Because that effort requires passion, it requires a steadfastness, and an ability to see the end game, to see that there will be success at the end of all that striving. And that is what has held me to this passion of communicating this history that was once forgotten. But you know what? It didn't start out that way. It started out more like, because when I was, thank you, but when I was a kid growing up in Detroit, and when I say Detroit, I'm not referring to metropolitan Detroit, I'm referring to the inner city of Detroit. I'm referring to that stretch of concrete, asphalt, and steel between 6 Mile Road and Livernois and 8 Mile Road. And where I was growing up and when I was growing up back in the 60s and the 70s. Anyone here remember the 60s and 70s? The excitement, the passion that was going on at that time? You know, national parks were so far removed from my experience that although I had dreams of them, I had no idea that I would ever end up working in a national park, let alone becoming a ranger in Yellowstone. Oh, excuse me. Or a ranger in Yosemite. But that did happen. And all I can say is that I owe all that thank yous, because this is all really about thank yous. I owe the thank you to my mother and my father. My mother and father are not here. My mom passed away this year, just back in June. My dad passed away a few years ago before he had a chance to see the Ken Burns film, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. But I do know, without any doubt whatsoever, that my mom and my dad have the best seats in the house. Right there. And I owe them this day, because years and years ago, when I was only 5 years old, I was just a little boy accompanying my parents to Germany, where my dad was stationed in the army. And there was a family trip while we lived in Bavaria. I still can't believe that I lived in Bavaria. And there was no litter at that time. because people were so concerned about the beauty of those mountains. But there were always a few people who could care less. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, thank you. This is a designated role. So there was a family trip to Berchtesgaden, which is now a sister park to Yosemite. And I stood there between my mother and my father, and I still remember that moment. I still remember the pressure of my mother's hand in my hand here, and my father's hand in my hand here. And the wind was blowing, and I was way, way, way up in the sky above the world. And I never knew a human being could be so high, but as I was, because you could look down and peer into this shadowy canyon and see the sun going through the cloud and landing on the earth thousands of feet below. I thought to myself, heaven must be something like this, to be elevated above the world itself and to still be alive and still drawing breath. And the wind was blowing so hard, I was absolutely certain that it was my parents' hands that kept me anchored to the earth. There are certain memories in this world, especially those involving your parents and family, that you never forget. And I never felt anything more powerful than my mother and father holding me to the earth itself. And I never forgot that moment, which was so good, because not too long afterwards, we were back in Detroit. And I don't know if you folks are aware of this, but there's very little resemblance between Berchtesgaden and Detroit. How many folks have thought they were confused by the two areas and thought there was a lot in common between the Bavarian Alps and inner city Detroit? Very, very different environments. So when I found myself back in Detroit, none of my friends had had an experience like that. And I almost began to forget that I had had that experience because it was so profoundly different. I could close my eyes and see those clouds, close my eyes and feel the coldness of the wind and see the sky, the bluest sky I've ever seen. And yet there I was in Detroit, which was circumscribed by asphalt and steel in rectangles. It was all geometry. And beyond a certain boundary, I did not have the courage to go. Beyond another boundary, I did not have the courage to go. My school was challenging. Where a neighboring high school would show up at my junior high school, and their idea of recreational activity was to beat up freshmen. No one had introduced to them the value of intramural sports. They thought that that was the way, victimizing other kids, young kids. And so it was sometimes a predatory environment, but it was also an environment filled with love because people looked out for each other. But most importantly, I am here talking to you right now because I never let go of my parents' hands. I still remember what it felt like to be on that mountaintop. And one day I shared that memory with my mother. And she said to me, "You're remembering Bavaria. You're remembering when we lived near the Black Forest in Germany." That is why and how I came to speak to you today. It is not because of anything that I've done. It is solely because of everything that my parents did. And that's why for me, the most powerful thing anyone can do, any parent can do, is to allow for their child to have an experience in the national parks. Why? They were called in the early days America's Wonderlands, and the reason for that, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland had not been published much earlier than Yellowstone. 1872, March 1st, is when Yellowstone was created. So it was in the language, it was in the air at the time, America's Wonderlands. But so few communities of color, so few African Americans or Asian Americans or Hispanic Americans are told that these places belong to them. So I took it upon myself, which was easy to do because I worked for the government, I took it upon myself to be the emissary to share that inheritance with them and let them know that they were the owners of America's best idea, but particularly African Americans, because they are least likely to be seen in our national parks. And the first thing an African American family might say to me outside the context of Yosemite is, well, what do those places have to do with us? I would say something like this. Well, perhaps not much, but now that I think about it, back in 1899, 1903, and 1904, the 24th Infantry, colored, which was the term in those times, and the 9th Regiment of Cavalry protected Yosemite and Sequoia. They were the sole protectors of the national parks in those years, 1903 and 1904. And that history was almost absolutely, completely forgotten. And only around 5 people in Yosemite knew that the 9th Cavalry was there. So how many folks here recognize that I was somewhat bothered by that? How many folks here would use stronger language? I felt that that story needed the greatest level of amplification possible. So I took it upon myself to tell that story. And keep this in mind. How many folks here looking at me think that I'm fairly comfortable standing here before you? I was voted class shy in my high school. I was so shy in high school that is the main reason why I did not stay with my chosen vocation as a classical clarinetist. I dreamed of one day performing with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, George Shelton conducting, and there I was, first chair, first clarinet. Why did that dream not come true? Because I was so shy. But when this story fell in my lap, and the ranger that was telling the story prior to my work left Yosemite, I looked around for someone who was suitable to tell this story. And then I recalled I was the only permanent African-American ranger in Yosemite. So I realized I had to get beyond my shyness. I had to get beyond my fear. I had to get beyond my fear of failure. I had to be as strong as the spirits of those soldiers were strong, because my worst day in this world was a good day for those Buffalo soldiers. So if they could deal with indifference, with outright antagonism, with outright hostility, if they could have parents that were lynched for the merest transgression in Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, because these men were the sons and grandsons of enslaved people. If they could deal with that and hold themselves tall and have their shoulders back and be willing to raise their voice, because I recognize that spirits cannot speak for themselves. Their voices must be amplified, and history must be amplified in order for it to be heard. And I had to be willing to release that from me on their behalf. I had to raise my voice, and I had to speak loudly, even though I recognized the volume of my voice would fill some people with fear because of the color of my skin and the world that I live in. So I knew I had to have a balance in how I told that story. And this was the balance, by recognizing the common humanity that all people share, and that to look out into the audience and not see strangers, but to see brothers and sisters. This is the 60s reference. And people who want me to succeed and want to hear that story that involves them, because how many people here, show of hands, love their protected areas, their national parks, their state parks and county parks? How many folks here feel a sense of reprieve and comfort and connection whenever you go out into the outdoors?
Woo. Yes.
This is my externalized soul, my spirit. I've never been here before, and yet I've always been here. Why? Because it's outside. It's on the earth itself, which is just one little place. And we get so separated by it. I remember some of the Apollo astronauts, once they landed on the moon, they talked about how they could block out the entire earth with one extended thumb. And everything that anyone has ever fought for, anything that anyone has ever died for, all blotted out. All those lives, all the loves lost, all the struggles fought, all just extinguished by just one thumb. And that means basically that this entire planet is just one place run by the Committee for Green Foothills that stretches all the way to the Hindu Kush and the Himalaya. It's one big place. And that is the greatest vision that has been given to us in the 20th century, is that perception that the astronauts provided by being on the surface of the moon and watching the earth rise up. If everyone in this world could have experienced that, wars would have ended a long time ago, because people would have said, I know those people. We're family over there, because we're just that one family.
Yeah.
And I'm not running for office, just so you know. But I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to the Committee for Green Foothills. I want to say thank you for you coming out here and experiencing the heat of this sun. But what you'll remember, hopefully, are the words that I'm saying that bind us all together. Because those are words, and government officials don't usually say this, but they're words of love. Because what I have found in my own experience is that rangers are basically people who are in love. And people who are in love look like this. So even that law enforcement ranger that gave you a ticket for speeding, before he walked up to your window, he was like this. And if I rule the world, I would make it illegal for any American to not have visited a national park,
Yes.
a county park, a state park. And when people say to me, they're just parks, I would say, no, they're more than just parks. How many people here, show me your hands, your favorite place happens to be circumscribed by a boundary indicating a park? How many folks here find your heart and your spirit and your sense of renewal in a park? So how many folks here would also agree that park is a poor word to describe what you're feeling and what your family feels with you when you're inside an environment that is the earth itself?
Woo!
So I came all the way here to say thank you, and I only recognize that I've gone nowhere at all. I've never left Yosemite. This, from my point of view, is still Yosemite. When I arrived, oh, my voice got quieter. That's how history works too. Sometimes your voice ges quieter. And eventually, if that happens, you just have to respond. Because if the world is not willing to amplify your voice, you raise your own voice. And all the people here, all we would have to do is all start walking in the same direction, and that's called a movement. That's called the 60s. That's called concern and direction, a point of view, and a philosophy driven by love of something. Human beings working together, passionately connected to something that is important to all people everywhere. That's why I'm here.
Woo! Yeah.
Because the one thing that I've learned is that it is a lie that we as individuals are powerless. Nothing is more powerful than a human being committed to a particular goal that will affect real change in the world. And when that human being can reach out and find a like-minded human being who each pull each other up, and that person finds another like-minded person, and all of a sudden you don't feel so alone because you are